Hello, everyone. It is with great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Henry Bourne. Dr. Bourne started his career as a newspaper reporter. He then pursued to obtain his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University, and after a residency in internal medicine in New York and a postdoctoral training at the NIH, he came to UCSF School of Medicine in 1971, where he stayed for the rest of his academic career. His research focused on trimeric G proteins and G protein coupled receptor, yielded more than 200 scientific publications and more than 6,000 citations, and trained dozens of scientists now holding positions in both academy and industry. He served as the chair of the pharmacology department at UCSF from 1984 till 1992, was elected for the National Academy of Sciences at 1994, and retired in 2008 after 4 decades of fruitful scientific work. Since then, Dr. Bourne has been engaged in policy and organizational issues concerning the U.S. biomedical research enterprise, trying to address and solve some of the current financial and structural flaws of the field. He has published 2 books, the first, a memoir, Ambition and Delight, in 2009, about the pain and joy of the scientific endeavors, and the second, an historical recap, Path to Innovation, in 2012, about some of the major scientific breakthroughs of our time occurring in the School of Medicine over a decade. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Bourne.
Thank you for that flattering introduction. I used to wince when people said he started in 1971, because everybody in the audience would go, oh, Jesus, you know, what is going to happen now? This ancient, doddering old fart is going to get up and try to talk to us. And now I am actually sort of reveling in it, because what I have before me is a group of young farts who are old farts in the making. And it is just a fantastic thrill. And I want to tell you why it's a thrill that you're here. I have to get my slides up. How do I get that to happen?
Yes.
All right, see? That's what happens when you get to be elderly. Okay, it's really thrilling, because I have been trying, and a number of my colleagues have been trying, to get PIs, the NIH, leading lights in biomedical research administration to pay attention to the problems that are ongoing. And what one usually gets is, well, if the NIH would just start giving us money like they used to do, everything would be just fine. Well, when they were giving us the money, we had a wonderful time, and we did wonderful things, but we laid down the problems that you are all facing today. And so my generation and generations after me created the problems that you guys are facing. And what I see here is enough people not to fill this large auditorium, but to make it feel populated, and they are passionate about really trying to make change happen. And that is a thrill. And so the function of my talk, what I'm really going to do, is to tell you about this title. Somebody already mentioned you are the future, and I'm adding to that is you have to make it work, because you're making it work for yourselves. And you cannot trust or rely upon your elders to do that because they made it the way it is, okay? That means you have a huge responsibility, and you have to do that. And so what I'm going to do is to begin by pontificating about what has happened and what some of the problems are. Talk about many of the difficulties that you're going to face. Well, I went in the prelude here, somebody came up to me and said, well, there's not a big crowd, but you know, this is not an exciting or cheerful topic. Well, it isn't cheerful. That's the problem. It isn't cheerful. I'll try to make it cheerful occasionally, but it will actually be tough. And your task over the next how many years till you get to be an old fart like me is going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. But I think you have huge advantages, and I'm going to end up talking about what the advantages are. And they, as you will guess, they clearly have to do with youth. Now, what happened to me in 1971 when I first had a research group was a very exciting world. Recombinant DNA wasn't quite there, but it was about to be. We really thought the world was our oyster, and it was. We had lots of things to do, wonderful questions to ask. The powerful tools gradually unrolled over the next decade, and it was fantastically exciting. I was surrounded by a group of very smart, imaginative, enthusiastic scientists who were having a wonderful time. And I learned that science was more fun than anything a human being can do with their clothes on, okay? So, I want you to think about that. It doesn't, I'm not talking about swimming either. It doesn't seem as much fun now. And when I wrote my books, one was a memory book about my own career, and the other one was about scientific discoveries in the 1970s, what I realized was how fantastically different the world was then. There was huge expansion going on. There were lots of resources to be had. The NIH was generous. Youth was rewarded. You were welcomed when you were a young person coming into that. You didn't have to be so smart. You just had to know you were going to bust your ass, and you would succeed. And that generally worked. The future seemed bright, and it really was bright. Okay? So now let's bump up to the 21st century. We've still got the best of times in some ways. We've got beautiful questions to ask on every hand. We've got fantastically powerful scientific tools. We've got a whale of a lot of smart, imaginative scientists working on them. But there's a sort of a problem. There's a kind of a cognitive dissonance. We talk about this, but then we notice that, you notice on your left, there's a picture of paradise by Hieronymus Bosch. On the right is hell by Hieronymus Bosch, and there's a lot of hell around that you guys have learned a great deal about. It is in some ways the very worst of times because of what we did to make it that way. And what you have to do is to deal with that cognitive dissonance, the enormous opportunities that are there, and then the very real difficulties of realizing them. And that's why it's not so cheerful. In fact, it feels like the myth of Sisyphus. It's a very big rock, and one is pushing it very hard, and it's hard. And I've listed here some of the problems which all of you know about, and if you've read the diatribes that I have written, or the diatribe that Bruce Alberts and his colleagues did in PNAS a few months ago, you know about all of these. There is ferocious competition. There's an unsustainable system given what's going in biomedical science. There's a huge shift away from basic research into and away from PI-initiated research to problems that are posed, or questions that are posed by the NIH or by some large entity that sometimes are really important questions and sometimes are less exciting, but people get paid to do them, and that is a problem. We need to harness the real initiative and innovation that's in individuals, and we're not doing that anywhere near as well as we were when we were flush with money. Now, it isn't just that we don't have enough money. What we've done is to build a system that is resistant to change because it's so complicated and has so many positive feedback loops that keep it the way it is, so that just a little nudge and you could make it extremely unstable. Well, we're getting those nudges, and it is becoming unstable, and that's a problem. In addition, we have weaker and weaker support from the federal government and from the American people, that they used to be enthusiastic about science. Now they're not. Congress has never been anything but unthinking and feckless, but it used to be unthinking and feckless and in our favor. Now it is not, okay? That's a big change. And we have to deal with all of those things at once. Now, that rock that Sisyphus is pushing up the hill is a huge rock. And the problem with it is, I've listed some of the problems. One of them is that it's not well understood. And the reason it's not well understood is that it's so complicated, that's part of it. And another one is it's not cheerful and nobody wants to pay much attention to it. And what's really happened is that your colleagues and your role models will frequently tell you you're foolish to pay attention to this. You ought to be in the lab busting your ass making discoveries, because if you spend your time on this, you're bound to lose. Well, I think you're bound to lose if you don't spend time on this and if you don't recruit people to do that. And that's what I'm trying to, that's my real message today, is that you've got to really grab hold of your destinies and make something happen. What you'll find is that the older people, some of them really do see the problems and really want to change things, but they are outnumbered often by people who are delighted to be in charge because the system suits them just fine. And as you may know, vision does not improve always with age. So you mustn't expect all institutional leaders to agree with you, encourage you, or even to listen to you. And you probably have already felt some of that. You'll feel more. But you have to make them listen, which means you have to talk loud and you have to get allies. And you really must do that. And what the rest of this talk, or much of the rest of this talk, will be about is that you have to pick your targets and really focus your effort on things that you can do something about, not on pissing and moaning about how bad things are, but saying, yes, they really are bad. Let's go after the things that can have something done about them. And I want to talk about how we try to think about that. So the first thing we do is that list that I gave you, all of which is a correct list, is full of large amorphous problems that you cannot formulate into terms that you can actually do something about. Each of you in the lab has learned that that's the way research is. You start off with some problem that seems wonderful, and then you realize that you haven't asked a question that could be answered. And that the task is to ask a question that can be answered and you can do something about. Well, you have to do that. When it's so complicated and discouraging and miserable, dump it and start over. And try to figure out something, what are the characteristics of questions that you do want to go after? And what are they? One of them is that there should be, in each one of those, a set of conditions or problems that are palpable and that cry out for change so that people who are affected by them know that they have to change. And there has to be a light at the end of the tunnel. You have to think about whether it's a tractable question. Now, tractable doesn't mean something that you can fix next week. But it does mean something that will not take 50 years to change. Somewhere between next week and 50 years, you've got to set a line and think about what you can do. It has to have identifiable agents, and they can't be literally everybody, okay? You have to know who are the people whose minds and behaviors have to change. Frequently, you'll find they're us. But that's okay, you'll do it. You have to have quantifiable variables that are part of the problem and quantifiable results that you want to get at, that are concrete, that you can enumerate and actually measure. You have to think about problems that can be dealt with in gradual ways or with piecemeal effects, piecemeal problem solving that doesn't fix everything but fixes a little bit and sets the stage for the next one. You got to go slow because this is a complicated business and great big actions are sure to screw it up. You can be certain of that. So you do it slowly but very deliberately. You try experiments when you possibly can. And then the last characteristic is every problem you tackle should be something that is both local and national. And when we come to list them, you'll see that they do have both local and national characteristics. This is not the NIH's problem alone. We like to pretend that the NIH caused this. They didn't cause it. We and our institutions and NIH and Congress and the public caused it together. And we have to think about that and think about how we can apply pressures and make changes happen at lots of different levels. Okay, so now, what are the visible, palpable conditions that cry out for change? Well, one of them is the quality. People talk a lot about we have too many graduate students or too many postdocs and so on and so forth for the jobs available. That's probably correct. It's very poorly documented in numbers, but it's probably correct. But what's really true is it's enormously spotty in its quality. The training of these. You know that there are places, within one institution, there are often different labs or different departments that do it, some superbly and some abominably. And that if you go across many institutions, there are some that are hardly training anybody at all or paying attention to training. They have trainees, but they're not being trained to do anything. That is a big problem. We've got this huge postdoc holding tank that has been around for a long time. We've created a system in which the purpose of graduate school is to produce postdocs. And the purpose of postdocs is to do the work of a PI. And it has nothing to do, in many cases, with becoming a scientist in the eyes of the people who are in charge. That is not a good thing. And that holding tank is a disaster, and it needs to be fixed. Now, the rest of these things are problems that create huge difficulties for individual PIs and scientists who are trying to get something done. The trainees and young people suffer most from them, but everybody does. One of them is there's a huge amount of extra effort that is unnecessary and wasted often, writing too many grants just to stay alive, shoehorning papers into fancy journals, dealing with myriad regulations. There's soft money salaries, which are a recipe for mediocrity because the universities are allowing the NIH to decide who is a good scientist rather than taking responsibility for betting themselves and putting their own skin in the game. That is a real problem, and it needs to be dealt with. And you can count on the fingers of one hand people who really actually want to do anything about it or who've thought about it. It's tough. There are indirect cost rules that some of you will have read about. We could talk about that till the cows come home, and you would be bored silly, but those things are changing the lives of every scientist in every research institution in this country. And the last problem that I've listed here is about age and youth. And we'll come back to this one. I'm going to drop it now, but I want to tell you that I think it's both the hardest problem and the most important. And we have to deal with it. It doesn't have an easy answer. The problem is fundamentally that youth is not well served now, anywhere near as well served as it was when I was learning to be a scientist. And old people are in charge, and they love being in charge, and they are satisfied with what's happening, and that is a serious problem. It needs to be dealt with. Now, we can't go out and shoot everybody who is older than 55. It's just not going to happen. So something has to happen, and you guys are the ones who are going to make it happen. So you have to think about that, and we'll come back to that later. You have huge advantages that you need to recognize. So what can we do about the rest of these things? Well, let's look for tractability of the agents, concrete measures, potential experiments, and what I come up with is a list that if you read the Alberts et al. Article in PNAS, or if you read any of the myriad diatribes that I've engaged in, will not be a surprise to you. They're only semi-tractable because each one of them is very difficult and has lots of pieces, but I've listed them here. They are the fact that we made a Faustian bargain back in the 1970s to say that trainees were the workforce of our laboratories. And that's a huge problem because it gives us a lot more people than sometimes the economy is able to take care of at the end. And we're not doing that right. The soft money salaries that we mentioned, indirect cost rules, peer review and grant awards that are arbitrary and difficult and arranged in ways that actually make it very difficult to be innovative. And science publishing is in great disarray, as I bet you everybody in this room has been caught in the difficulty of trying to shoehorn a paper into Cell, Nature, or Science, or some leading journal, and much of that effort is actually wasted effort, although wasted effort from a scientific point of view, people are correct in thinking that you need to succeed at that to get certain kinds of jobs. And that by itself is a huge problem, and it needs to be dealt with. So now, what's common to all of these problems? One is that they all began in actions that at the time were really good for research, frequently when research was expanding very rapidly and there were lots of resources. They are still good for somebody. Somebody's profiting from them now. It isn't you, but somebody is, and that's why they're still there. They're also, all of them, immensely complex on their own. But they're even more complicated because they intertwine with one another, and they involve stakeholders who are local and national, and there are lots of them, and they all have vested interests in keeping it the way it is. And worse, that feckless Congress and government has to do something about many of them to really make big change. Now, that means they have to be persuaded or bludgeoned into making change. And the problem with this complexity and the interwoven quality of all of these problems is that we need to make changes at every level in every venue at once. And that means that you can't just tackle NIH, but you have to tackle institutions and PIs and laboratories. You have to do all of those things at once. That really is tough. So the main point, or one of my major points about these, is that each of these problems is not just national. It isn't just the NIH. It has local ramifications and local behaviors that are making them continue. The trainees and workforce equation is very much embedded in the whole way we've organized biomedical research laboratories. The soft money salaries are essential for every major biomedical research institution academic institution to work. They would disappear without that. Well, you know, it's hard to deal with, but they're also pernicious. So that has to be dealt with somehow. You can't go in and just stop soft money salaries, but you have to deal with it some way or another and not just say, well, it's too big a problem to fool with. Indirect costs the same way. Peer review and grant awards, all of them have local and national aspects that need to be dealt with. And this is one subject where I differ with the worthies that were led by Bruce Alberts in PNAS. They wrote a prescription for change that seemed to rely exclusively on NIH. Because NIH is in charge and it's the only place that they thought you could put pressure on and get something to happen. And I will tell you that NIH is really a sort of a sheltered workshop of paper tigers. It's not going to do anything by itself unless you and our institutions tell them to. They need the institutions badly. They badly need the PIs to want something, or they won't do it. And the last 10 years, if you look at the measures that have been taken, what they say this or that commission says they've got to do so and so and so and so, and what they always do is the smallest possible change that could ever be made. It's infinitesimally small, and it produces zero effect. And the reason they do that is that they're afraid of losing not just the Congress, but the people who are advocating for them with the Congress, who are the PIs and the institutions. Well, so they're not going to do anything unless the institutions themselves realize what's going on, and the PIs themselves realize what's going on and push for change. That's why you've got to have action that is in both venues. If you rely on the NIH to do it by itself, you might as well forget it. It's just not going to happen. So this part I'm going to go very quickly through because it's so obvious. The remedies that we can put into this system, all of them are capable of producing unintended consequences. That is one scary business. That's the situation we're in now. There were wonderful remedies for our problems back in the 1970s. We instituted them, and now we're dealing with the unintended consequences. That's going to happen with whatever we do now. That means we have to be really thoughtful and careful and set these things up so that they can be changed when it's necessary. And that means we've got to test ideas with experiments. It means that no one remedy is going to do anything. We've got to have multiple things working at once. The remedies have to be applied gradually, piecemeal if necessary. And because this is a systemic disorder, we mustn't make the cure worse than the disease. And that is an easy thing to do with a system that's built the way ours is. So I had a long diatribe here about training versus workforce. I'll just give you the bottom line here, which is that any remedy that's really going to change this in an effective way will eventually change the composition of laboratories. It's just got to. You cannot continue to train the way we're doing in this sort of haphazard way where some people are trained and some people are just worked. You've got to actually have training be subject to real peer review, and it isn't peer reviewed if it's paid for by research grants, which pays a huge fraction of our training costs for both postdocs and for graduate students. We've got to work out ways of changing that. And there are lots of changes. I've listed some of them here, many others. Each one of them is going to have a lot of problems and cannot be imposed like that by the NIH or anybody else in a quick way. But we have to work out ways of making them deliberate change that is gradual and that is people get a lot of notice for. And we're going to have to end up with labs that have a lot more staff scientists in them who are paid more, and postdocs who are paid more and who have very limited, clearly limited times that they can be a postdoc. They cannot be named something else that is just a postdoc by another name and get them out of that and not pay them a dime more. That's got to be forbidden. And the NIH can do that if it will. But institutions live on keeping people around for 7 or 8 years. They don't want to do that. They want to not pay them anything, and that's the way it is. That's got to change. So we talked about quantification. Experiments, I would love to talk about some of these experiments with you because I think they should be done. The time to degree of a graduate program. We need to know whether the Cold Spring Harbor Watson labs are really able to do a good job of training people in 4.5 years to a PhD, and whether that's exportable to other places, because if it is, it should be done. Well, nobody's doing that, you know, nobody's paying any attention to it. That needs to be tested. We need better experiments with journals and this problem of the significance stamp that you get from Cell Nature and Science and how that is done in a way that it can be controlled. And I've got some ideas about both of those things. John Lorsch at NIGMS is really starting an experiment called MIRA that is going to start testing whether you can give individual PIs grants that will cover all of their NIH-funded research rather than making them apply for different projects. That's going to be opposed by a lot of people, and it's going to be tough to judge, but it has many advantages that we need to explore. And I think doing that as an experiment first is a really good idea. So now I'm coming to the end, and I'm going to come back to this business about youth being served. We've talked about how powerful leaders like to keep their power. That's how they got to be leaders, and they want to hold on to it. I have every day some person comes up to me and says, "Henry, I'm furious with you." And I say, why is that? He said, I got my 4th NIH grant was turned down. It wasn't renewed. And I talked to the head of the institute, and he said, well, you ought to talk to your colleague, Henry Bourne, because he's been saying we need to give more money to young people. And he said, Henry, you took my grant away. And he said, I'm doing the best work of my career. Now, this guy is doing really good work. He's not an idiot. He's also not young. I mean, you don't suddenly lose all your brain cells when you get to be old. He's really a good scientist. And in the best of all possible worlds, he should have 4 grants. But it isn't the best of all possible worlds. It just isn't. And it needs to be, that kind of problem needs to be dealt with. Well, that's an individual, but that happens with chairs. It happens with deans. They don't want to change. They're terrified of change, and their interest is not in changing. So young people get discouraged from even being interested in this. Many of my younger colleagues, brilliant scientists, men and women, are afraid or unwilling to even get interested in the problems that we've been talking about, because it will take away from their absolutely necessary work in the research lab. And they have this feeling that anybody who does administration of any kind, well or badly, is kind of an idiot. And we shouldn't let them free out in the world, and we certainly shouldn't talk to them. So that kind of attitude, cynical apathy, is a real danger. Now, what I think is that many of you all have not yet succumbed to that. That's why you're here. And that's why it's so exciting to stand up and talk to you. And let me tell you, you have huge advantages that will help you if you do decide to grab hold of your destinies in the future, now and in the future. And this meeting is a sign that you're doing that. So one of them, I don't even list here, but it's perfectly obvious, being young gives you more energy than anybody else. And that is not to be sneezed at. You need every bit of energy you got if you're going to do this and try to do science at the same time. You just got to have that. But you also have in your favor the fact that you're looking for jobs. So if you're looking for academic jobs, and in this crowd, my bet is there will be more than 15% of you who will find academic jobs. That 15% is across the country. This is Boston, after all. And there are many more than 15% here who are going to succeed in that way. If you are, make one of your criteria going to a place where you find at least one person who has some power, who actually wants young people to be engaged in what's going on. And when you get there, get allies. Get young allies and older allies. You'll find some of the older people really are your allies, and they want to be. And some of the young people will. You've got to do that. You can't do this by yourself. You'll go crazy if you do. You have to make alliances and do that. And we've already talked about picking your skirmishes and your battles carefully. You don't tackle everything at once. You tackle something that you think you care a lot about, and you end up knowing more about it than anybody else. And it turns out that's not going to be very difficult, because your average dean doesn't understand where the money comes from and goes. I mean, that's actually true. That's something I have discovered. There are deans who do, but most of them don't know what's going on, and that allows them to continue doing exactly what they've been doing. Well, if you find out where the money is in some particular area and how it's being spent, It will be a lot of work, and it's sort of boring. But you know, pipetting is not all that exciting either. You have to go through the boring stuff to get anywhere. So do it, and realize that the victories are not going to be quick. They will happen. But the main thing you have as an advantage is that time is on your side. You are going to be able to wear the bastards down, okay? And you should take a huge advantage of that. But you won't do it if you allow yourself to decide you don't want to deal with these problems. You have to go after them, and you have to do it now and then for a very long time in the future. That's just the way it is, and I hope to hell that happens. The time is on your side. I want to tell you, when I became a chair of a department, I was in my early 40s, and I thought I knew how to do this. And furthermore, at that time, it was okay. You weren't quite an idiot if you were a chair, or wouldn't consider an idiot. I sort of was, but I did that. And I got very frustrated at the difficulties of getting the older members of the department to get off their asses and do something. And it was not easy. And I went and complained to a man who I revere, who was a very powerful and very important mentor to me. And I said, well, how do I get? Let me tell you about this. And I tell about this problem and that problem. And he said to me, Henry, there's an adage that is so important in administering any academic endeavor, but especially in biomedical research. And you must remember this. Where there's death, there's hope. So, Jesus Christ, what a depressing notion. But it turned out he didn't mean they had to actually die. Some of them had to be persuaded to retire. Some of them had to be persuaded that they had already retired in situ, and you could make something happen. Well, you're going to be able to wear those bastards down, so do it. Okay? So, thus endeth the sermon. You are the future. Do your damnedest to make it work. Thank you.
Okay. We can use the
mic.
That's okay. One quick question.
Do we have mobile mics?
Yeah, just give me that one.
This question, that's not. Here, I'll ask it. This question came in on Twitter. Is focusing on giving more money to young scientists equivalent to graduating them into the old men's club and the old boys club way of thinking?
It is if they allow that to happen. You know, everybody can be bought, but if you keep raising the price, you might not be bought, and that's what you do, okay? If they want you enough to actually give you a grant, that means you're doing something right. And then what you do is you keep on pushing, and having that grant will give you power to make something happen. It also takes away power if you decide, well, I've got a grant and I'm just wonderful and I can just have a good time. Well, that's true, but it also, the universities care about those indirect costs. If you're bringing in indirect costs, you suddenly become valuable, okay? And that is what you have to take advantage of. You don't just say you've become great because you've got a grant. What you do is you use that as leverage. And I've never answered a Twitter question before. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you said that 15 or more % of us would end up getting PI positions. How do you be part of the change if you leave academia?
So,
A lot of us are in it, right?
okay, how do you be part of the change if you leave academia? Well, that is a big question, because if you leave academia and still do research, okay, now if you don't do research, then there are plenty of things you can do. You can do policy, for instance. You can work for journals, et cetera, et cetera. The demand is not super high for people who do those things, but they have potential real ways they can make something happen. Now, supposing you work for a company. We have some people here who work for companies, and not all of those people, you know, when I was young, the people who went to Gordon conferences from companies were almost uniformly dull. I mean, deeply dull, and not interesting. That really has changed. It's changed enormously. Very, very often, the people you meet in companies are smarter than your own colleagues in your university, and that is exciting. Now, they don't have the time to get in there and fight the academic battles, but one of the things that some of them do is to realize, if, for instance, if they work for Big Pharma, that what Big Pharma needs is not for the NIH to be making chemicals and screening them, but to understand, learn how diseases work and how normal systems work. And we haven't done that well. Translational research is worthless if you got nothing to translate. And that is something that a lot of people who are scientists working for companies know. And they need to say it louder, but people like Vagelos have said that very loudly. He was not heard with delight by the current NIH leadership, but the current NIH leadership needs to hear it a lot more often. So that's the kind of thing, I mean, you know, it is to the advantage of drug companies to have people actually trying to understand how things work, and not to spend every waking moment trying to solve a disease. You're not solving a disease. Diseases, all the solvable diseases have been solved, okay? There are diseases that are just as complicated as the biomedical research system, okay? Well, it's not so easy to deal with those, and that we need to think about how to deal with that sort of complexity and tease apart little pieces of it and find out where the places are that intervention can actually do something well. Well, that's hard, and it can't all be done by drug companies. In fact, much of it can't be done by drug companies, but they need to know it, and they know they need to know it, and if they will come out and say so frequently and loudly, eventually somebody will hear. The NIH has a sort of a deafness problem, but it can be overcome by people who try to do that. So that's not, you know, it's not telling you about what this individual here can do or that individual, but these are the kinds of things that one can do to help that. Now, in the companies, I can bet you that there are problems that are parallel to the ones that universities have. I know nothing about them, but because they're large institutions, you can bet your ass that the way they run themselves causes a lot of troubles that are unnecessary or bad for actual drug discovery. Well, you know, that's a place that one can work too. That's policy of a different sort, but by God, it's important. Yeah.
So how do you feel about pharma, large companies actually funding academic research, these new partnerships and these new hybrid institutions? Is that a helpful solution, or is that just avoiding a problem?
Okay, so how do I feel about Big Pharma coming in and setting up programs with universities? Well, it's complicated, okay? And the reason it's complicated is that Big Pharma, they're in business. They're not the least bit interested in doing things, spending vast amounts of money to make people happy out there in the universities. They want to actually get value for money, and they do. I think so. We have to actually, as academic institutions, pick and choose what we do there, and not go for every project they go for. I had an interview with a leading light in a major biomedical institution, who informed me, he read my book about paths to innovation back in the 1970s and how recombinant DNA and oncogenes and prions were worked out. And he said, it was really fun to read that. It was a lovely exercise in romance and nostalgia. But here's the way research funding works now. You must understand we do it very differently now. What we have is people in universities who are resource aggregators. That was him, okay? And resource aggregators go and get money from whoever will give it for whatever purpose they want, and then they find the people in the university who can best spend that money. And he said, you might imagine that that would not be a good thing for innovation, but after all, the aggregator doesn't tell the person precisely what to do from day to day. He just gives him the problem, okay? Now, my feelings were a little bit hurt by the nostalgia remark, and it's clear that at that institution, money, the relative amount of money that comes from private investment or donations for research has gone up relative to the NIH, and that helps to get indirect costs, because sometimes companies pay a lot better indirect costs than the federal government does. That is kind of interesting. But it skews the way the institution thinks about research. It makes the institution feel like basic research is no longer all that important. And so it's not that we should not do that. We absolutely should be doing that. But we should not lose our interest in doing research that isn't going to be funded in that way. And we shouldn't expect a drug company to pay one dime for it, because they're not going to. That real basic research, they're not going to do that, because they've got stockholders, after all. They have to, they have to pay attention to them. So it's all about practicalities, but keeping one's eye on the ball. And that's very difficult because people tend to go where money is. And one of the most pernicious problems, I think, in universities is that all the big academic research institutions have decided that the amount of money they get in grants and donations or investments or whatever, the size of their research program is the measure of their excellence. And that is bullshit. It's just wrong. And that is something we got to somehow or another fight, because, and the soft money is all part of that. If you can hire, as my institution does, 300 faculty members at least who get 80% or more of their salary from grants, you get all the indirect costs from that extra salary, and you don't have to worry about taking care of them until something happens. Those people are terribly vulnerable as faculty members, and they're not being judged by the university except in terms of whether they can get money to do their research. That is the the criterion of whether they're worthwhile. That is a real problem. And as I mentioned to somebody here, if you look, I've done this, if you look at the salaries those people make, their 100% is about 1/3 of the salary in the same department of the people who are getting only 5% of their salary from research. It's clear that the university doesn't care about those people. It doesn't pay them very much, but also it's getting all of the money from somewhere else. So that is a problem for quality and the way the thing works, and we need to be able to think about that. And I've got ideas about it. Everybody has ideas. Ideas are a dime a dozen. Something has to be done, and it has to be dealt with, not solved. We're not going to solve it, but we can do something about it, maybe. I'm glad to quit.
Thanks. Let's all give Henry another round of applause.